In September of 1999, an 18-year-old girl named Clara Wynn walked into a county land auction in eastern Oregon, carrying a folded blue irrigation map and $910 in cash. That was all she had. Not nearly enough to buy good land. Barely enough to get laughed at for trying. The auction was being held inside the livestock pavilion at the fairgrounds because the courthouse meeting room was too small for the farmers, bankers, and speculators who had come to pick over the failures left behind by 6 dry years and a crash in hay prices. Clara was the youngest person in the pavilion by at least 25 years. She was the only bidder who came alone, and she was the only person in the room who had spent the previous 11 months reading the part of the county drainage report that most people never unfolded. The parcel she wanted was called Unit 12. 142 acres of white alkali flat, 7 miles past the last paved road, with a wind-bent fence on one side and an abandoned beet shed sinking into the dust on the other. The catalog described it in 7 words. Saline benchland, poor drainage, limited farm value. Everyone in the county knew Unit 12 by a different name. The Salt Flat. For 20 years, families had tried to farm it and failed. Wheat burned yellow. Alfalfa came up thin, then vanished. When the ground dried, the surface turned hard and pale, like old bone. In July, salt crust gathered in the tire ruts so bright it looked like frost. At 10:18 that morning, the auctioneer lifted the page for Unit 12, smiled like a man being forced to sell a broken chair, and asked if anyone wanted to start the bidding. Nobody moved. A few men laughed before anyone said a word. Then Clara raised her hand from the back row and bid $46 an acre. The room went quiet for half a second. Then it laughed harder, because everyone in that pavilion thought Clara had just made the mistake of her life. They were wrong. The mistake had been made by everyone else. They had judged the land by the crust. Clara had read the fold. The fold was a narrow blue line on an irrigation map printed in 1976, then shelved in a metal cabinet behind the county watermaster's office. It showed an abandoned drainage lateral that had once crossed the north end of Unit 12 before being filled, forgotten, and buried under dust. That line mattered, because the official story of Unit 12 was that the land was naturally worthless. The map told a different story. It said the land had been damaged, and damage could be repaired. Clara knew that because of a woman named Ruth Elway. Ruth was Clara's grandmother, and for 36 years she had worked as a mapping clerk for the Deschutes Basin Reclamation Office. She was not a farmer. She was not a landowner. She did not wear boots to board meetings or stand in equipment yards giving advice. She sat at a drafting table. She copied survey numbers. She labeled drainage laterals. She filed boring logs from contractors who drilled down through dry ground and sent back paper records no one ever wanted to read. Ruth had a small house behind the feed mill, and in the back bedroom she kept steel map tubes under the bed. Every tube was labeled in her thin block lettering: bench drainage, salinity tests, well depths, aerials, boring logs. To Clara's cousins, those tubes were junk. To Clara, they were treasure. When Clara was 10, Ruth unrolled one of the maps across the kitchen table and held soup cans on the corners to keep it from curling back on itself. She showed Clara how a field could lie. A green field could be dying from underneath. A dead field could be alive below the crust. A straight ditch could change the fate of 100 acres. A missing line could cost a family everything. Ruth taught Clara to read contour marks and soil codes the way another grandmother might teach a child to stitch. She taught her that a map was not a picture. It was an argument. It was the land saying what it would do if anyone bothered to listen before putting a plow into it. The sentence Ruth repeated most often was simple: "Open the pages they leave folded." She said it when Clara got bored. She said it when a map table looked too dense. She said it when county men walked into the office asking for easy answers and ignored the binders sitting right beside them. Open the pages they leave folded, Clara. That is where the land keeps its secrets. Ruth died in October of 1998, just before Clara turned 18. She left no money. She left a tin map tube, 6 notebooks, and a key to the basement archive of the Reclamation office. Inside the tube was the 1976 Bench Drainage and Salinity Study, a 287-page report written after a failed irrigation expansion in the 1970s. Most of the report was as dry as flour. Tables, symbols, test pits, sodium readings, well depths, water movement. Maps that folded out 3 times wider than the page. On the inside of the map tube, Ruth had taped a note. For Clara. Open what they leave folded. So Clara did. For 11 months, after shifts stacking feed sacks at the mill, she sat at the kitchen table with Ruth's notebooks and read the report line by line. She made a list of every distressed parcel likely to sell in the county. Bank land, tax land, estate land, ground that looked ugly enough for a poor girl to afford. Most of it was exactly as bad as it looked. Then she reached Unit 12. At first it looked like the worst one on the list. The surface readings were terrible. The sodium level was high. The top 20 inches were compacted, pale, and nearly airless. The old crop records were miserable. Nothing in the auction catalog was false. But the catalog was only describing the crust. The truth was deeper. In Appendix F, on a folded sheet most readers would never pull out because it was tucked between 2 pages of numbers, Clara found Boring L-17. That test hole had been drilled in 1976 near the center of Unit 12. The first 20 inches were as bad as everyone believed. Then the log changed. Below the salt-pale crust was a buried alluvial loam, dark, deep and still structured. A river bench soil from before the irrigation works had changed the water movement across the flat. The log showed usable loam starting at roughly 22 inches and running to more than 6 feet. It showed better moisture retention than the surrounding benchland. It showed calcium already present below the damaged layer. It showed a field that was not dead. It showed a field trapped under its own bad skin. Ruth had circled boring L17 in blue pencil. Beside it, in her small, careful writing, she had written 4 words. Not worthless, just sealed. Clara stared at that line for a long time. Then she found the drainage map. The abandoned lateral had once taken seep water away from the north end of Unit 12. When it was filled, the water had nowhere to move. It rose and fell under the surface, pulling salts upward every dry season until the field slowly poisoned itself from the top down. That was why the land looked dead. Not because it had no value, because the value had been sealed under 20 inches of white failure. Clara spent the winter checking Ruth's work. She walked Unit 12 before sunrise so no one would ask why she was there. She carried an old hand auger wrapped in burlap. At the center of the field, she bored down through the hard white layer until her palms blistered. At 23 inches, the auger brought up black-brown crumbs. Not powder, not paste, crumbs, living structure. She held them in her palm under the cold morning light and knew that Ruth's folded sheet had been telling the truth. From that day on, Unit 12 was the only parcel that mattered. But knowing the truth and owning the land were 2 different things. Clara had $910 saved from 3 summers at the feed mill and 2 lamb seasons working for neighbors who paid late and expected gratitude. She had no equipment, no operating loan, no family land. Her father drove a fuel truck and rented the house they lived in. When Clara told him she was going to bid on Unit 12, he stared at her as if she had confessed to planning a robbery. He knew the place. Everyone knew the place. He told her dead ground did not become cheap by accident. Clara laid the map and Ruth's boring log on the table and tried to explain. Her father listened. But listening was not the same as believing. He had been around farmers his whole life, and he knew what happened to people who thought paper could beat weather. He did not forbid her. He only said, very quietly, "Do not spend your whole life proving a map was wrong." Clara folded the blue sheet and put it back in the tube. At the auction, she kept the tube on her lap while the good fields sold first. Men with cattle loans bought hay ground. A seed dealer bought 2 irrigated corners. A banker bought a road parcel he did not need because it touched land he already owned. Then came Unit 12. The auctioneer asked for an opening bid. Silence. He dropped the opening price twice. Still silence. Then Clara lifted her hand. $46 an acre. A man in the third row turned around to see who had spoken. When he saw Clara, he smiled like the world had just handed him a joke. The auctioneer asked if she understood what parcel they were selling. Clara said yes. He asked if she had seen the ground. She said yes. Someone muttered that seeing it must not have helped. The room laughed again. No one bid against her. Why would they? To them, Unit 12 was a white flat that ate seed, broke hearts, and collected taxes. The gavel fell at $6,532. Clara paid the $910 as the down payment and signed the papers with a hand that did not shake until she reached the parking lot. Outside, the wind came across the fairgrounds, carrying dust from the livestock pens. Clara sat in her father's truck, the map tube across her knees, and heard the laughter still moving through the building behind her. She did not cry. She did something harder. She opened the map again. The first problem was drainage. The second problem was money. The third problem was that everyone who had money thought the first two problems were proof that Clara should quit. She needed the filled lateral reopened along the north edge. She needed the top layer broken deep enough for amendments to move through it. She needed gypsum, seed, fuel, and a drill that could plant into rough ground. What she had was a map tube, and a field everyone called a mistake. The co-op refused her credit. The bank manager told her to lease the land for grazing and wait until she was older. A neighboring farmer offered to take it off her hands for what she had paid, and when she refused, he told her pride was a crop that never covered its own seed. By February, Clara had sold her grandmother's old car, and still did not have enough. That was when she went to see Gideon Marsh. Gideon was a drainage contractor who owned a rusted trencher, a deep ripper, and the kind of patience that comes from spending 30 years watching water ruin things slowly. He had installed tile and opened ditches across 3 counties. He had also seen more dreamers with bad land than he cared to remember. Clara brought him the folded blue map, boring L17, Ruth's notebooks, and a jar of dark loam she had pulled from 23 inches down. Gideon did not smile when she told the story. He did not encourage her either. He put on his reading glasses and studied the old drainage sheet for almost 20 minutes. Then he opened Ruth's notebook and traced the blue pencil circle around L17. He took the jar, shook it once, and crumbled the soil between his thumb and finger. At last he said, "If this came out of that flat, the flat is not the problem." Clara asked him what the problem was. Gideon looked back at the map. "The problem is that everybody has been farming the lid." He agreed to reopen the north lateral and deep rip the first 80 acres on credit, payable after harvest, if harvest came. Not because he felt sorry for Clara. Pity would have been cheaper. He agreed because the map made sense, the soil in the jar made sense, and Ruth's notes made him trust that the ground had been misread. On a cold March morning in 2000, Gideon hauled the trencher to Unit 12. Clara stood near the north fence in a canvas coat and watched the blade bite into the white crust. For the first 50 yards, the trench was ugly. Pale clay, salt streaks, hard-pan chunks that broke like chalk. Gideon climbed down once, looked at the spoil pile, and said nothing. Clara felt the fear rise so fast she could taste metal. For one terrible minute, the whole county was right. The auction laughter, the banker, her father, the neighbor, everyone. Maybe the folded sheet had been an old mistake. Maybe Ruth had circled the wrong hole. Maybe the dark crumbs in Clara's jar had been a lucky pocket in a dead field. Then the trencher cut deeper. The spoil pile changed color. A ribbon of black-brown soil rolled up through the white clay, wet enough to clump, dark enough that even from 20 feet away it looked like another field was climbing out from under the first. Gideon shut the engine down. The sudden silence hit harder than the machine noise. Clara stepped into the trench, knelt, and picked up the dark loam with both hands. It was cool. It held together. It smelled like wet roots, even though nothing green had grown there properly in years. Gideon stood above her, looking down at the line of dark earth exposed inside the cut. He said, "Your grandmother was right." Clara could not answer, because it was not just soil in her hands. It was Ruth's table, Ruth's map tubes, Ruth's blue pencil, Ruth's patient voice telling a child that land speaks in places people are too impatient to open. The next week, Gideon reopened the old lateral along the north edge and cut a shallow outlet to the drainage swale that had been blocked for years. He ran the deep ripper across the first 80 acres, tearing through the sealed layer and lifting dark streaks of loam into the pale surface. Clara spread gypsum with a rented buggy so old the lever had to be held in place with baling wire. By the end of April, Unit 12 no longer looked clean and dead. It looked wounded. That was an improvement. Clara planted barley in May because barley could tolerate a rough first year better than most crops, and because she could get the seed from a mill customer who liked Ruth, and pretended not to notice that Clara could not pay in full. The barley came up uneven. In some places it broke the surface in strong green rows. In others it struggled through the crust like it had to argue its way into daylight. The men at the feed mill watched the field the way people watch a bridge they expect to collapse. By June, it had not collapsed. By July, the barley on the ripped ground held color, while nearby fields faded in the heat. The summer was dry. Not a disaster, just dry enough to expose which fields had depth and which fields only had hope. Unit 12 had depth. Its roots found the buried loam. The old sealed layer began to open. The drainage lateral carried water away instead of letting it rise and drag salt back to the surface. In August, the first truck stopped along the fence. It belonged to Arnold Peak, a hay grower who had laughed at the auction loud enough for Clara to remember the sound. He got out, leaned on the fence, and stared at the barley. It was not the best crop in the county, not yet, but it was standing tall on ground everyone had sworn would not hold a crop worth cutting. Arnold walked the fence line for 10 minutes. That evening, he came to Clara's house with his hat in his hands and asked what she had done to the salt flat. Clara brought out the blue map. She showed him the abandoned lateral. She showed him boring L17. She showed him Ruth's note. Not worthless, just sealed. Arnold did not laugh this time. He asked if his west quarter had anything like that under it. Within 2 months, 3 more farmers came, then 7. They did not come to apologize. Farmers of that generation rarely knew how to do that cleanly. They came with plat maps, well records, tax descriptions, and questions they had not thought to ask until an 18-year-old girl made barley grow on the salt flat. Clara charged $25 for the first reading, then $50, then $150, because the work took hours, and because Ruth had taught her enough to know that free knowledge is often treated like cheap advice. She read drainage maps, well logs, boring sheets, old aerials, and salinity tables. She found clogged outlets, misclassified soil edges, buried gravel lenses, perched water problems, and fields that were not worthless but sealed, not poor but mismanaged, not cursed but misunderstood. Unit 12 paid its first note. Not easily, but it paid. In the second year, Clara ripped the remaining acreage and seeded a rotation that let the soil recover without asking too much too soon. In the third year, the barley yield nearly doubled the first crop. In the 5th year, the land appraised for more than 7 times what she had paid. By then, no one in the county called it the salt flat, unless they were telling the story of how wrong they had been. Clara did not become rich all at once. That was not how land worked. Land paid slowly, in seasons, in repairs, in risk. In mornings when the pump failed, and evenings when a storm missed by 2 miles. But Unit 12 did what Ruth's folded sheet had promised. It produced. And the map business produced too. By the time Clara was 30, she owned 3 more distressed parcels she had bought only after reading the records no one else wanted to read. By 40, she ran a small soil and drainage office out of the old beet shed she had repaired instead of tearing down. The shelves held Ruth's tubes, new survey binders, printed aerials, and jars of soil labeled by depth. Farmers who once trusted only what they could see began bringing Clara what they could not understand. Their fields had been speaking all along. They had simply needed a translator. Years later, the retired auctioneer came to see her. His name was Milton Carr, and by then his voice had gone thin from age. He walked into Clara's office on a spring afternoon and stood in front of the wall where the blue Unit 12 map was framed under glass. He looked at it for a long time. Then he said, "I sold you that land." Clara said, "You did. I asked if you knew what you were bidding on. You did. I thought I was protecting you from making a fool of yourself." Clara looked at the framed map. Milton swallowed. "The room laughed," he said. "I let them." Clara did not rescue him from the silence. After a while, Milton pointed at the map. "That line there, that is what they missed?" "That line," Clara said, "and the log that proved what was under it." Milton nodded slowly. "I always thought an auction found the value of a field." Clara turned from the map and looked at him. "No," she said, "an auction finds the value people are prepared to see." Outside the office window, barley moved in the wind across the field that had once been white and empty. "The field had its value before I lifted my hand," Clara said. "The report did not create it. The gavel did not create it. The laughter did not erase it. The value was folded into the record. Ruth found it. I opened it. Everyone else bid on the crust." Milton kept his eyes on the glass. "And you bid on what was underneath." Clara nodded. That was the whole story. Not a miracle. Not luck. Not a girl outsmarting a room because she was braver than everyone else. Bravery helped, but it was not the engine. The engine was attention. The kind of attention almost nobody respects until after it has already beaten them. Clara Wynn bought Unit 12 because she opened a folded sheet that had been waiting in a cabinet for 23 years. She trusted a boring log no one else had read. She believed a dead-looking field might be alive below the part everybody could see. The county saw white crust. Clara saw a sealed field. And the field paid the one who opened the fold.